Okay, now that we're recording, I'd like again to welcome everyone to our webinar. My name is Nick Tebbey, and I'm the National Executive Officer of Relationships Australia. We are a federation of community-based, not-for-profit organisations with no religious affiliation. Our services are for all members of the community, regardless of their religious belief, age, gender, lifestyle choices, cultural background, or economic circumstances. We've been providing relationship services across Australia for over 70 years. And through our programs, we work with people not only to enhance family relationships, but also relationships with colleagues, friends, and across communities. The connection between respectful relationships, human rights, mental health, and loneliness is inextricable. And this is why Neighbour Day is such an important campaign for us here at Relationships Australia. With Neighbour Day, we aim to empower all Australians to build sustainable social connections, and in doing so, to shift the tide of loneliness that has become so prevalent in our communities. Today, we will be finding out more about why Neighbour Day is an important campaign for our times. We'll be hearing from our Neighbour Day campaign manager, Sam Robinson, in relation to the origins of Neighbour Day, from one of our esteemed and much loved research colleagues, Associate Professor Tegan Cruwys from the Australian National University, and from our Senior Research and Project Officer at Relationships Australia, Claire Fisher. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce our Neighbour Day campaign manager, Sam, who will give us some historical perspective to the research that we have been conducting. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, Nick. I'm coming to you today from Biripi country on the lower mid-north coast of New South Wales. We're pretty soggy, but we're doing a lot better than our northern counterparts. I hope they're doing okay. So Neighbour Day was founded in Melbourne in Australia in March 2003 by a fellow named Andrew Heslop after the remains of an elderly woman were found inside her suburban home. Sadly, Mrs. Elsie Brown had been dead for 2 years. She'd been forgotten by her neighbours, her friends and her family. Now, Andrew didn't know Mrs. Brown, but he was shocked by the apparent ease with which the world had left her behind. Widespread media interest followed, and this prompted Andrew to suggest a national check on your neighbour weekend. This was refined, a bit hard to say, and it became Neighbour Day and was celebrated in 2003. Since then, Neighbour Day has progressed from a reminder to connect with elderly neighbours to an annual celebration of strong communities and friendly streets. People of all ages participate because everyone everywhere is a neighbour, no matter where you live, no matter what your personal circumstances are. The day has since grown into an ongoing year-round social connection campaign in neighbourhoods, workplaces, remote and regional areas and beyond. It seeks to address loneliness across Australia. So 2022 marks our 20th anniversary. But you might wonder how we became the home of Neighbour Day. Well, in 2013, we spotted a call out from the founder in Pro Bono News. After 10 years of Andrew doing it himself after hours and on weekends, he acknowledged that he had limitations as one person and he wanted to gift it to a bigger national organisation to engage all Australians and to be more inclusive. So we submitted an expression of interest. We were successful. There were about 40 odd NGOs applied. And he said he chose Relationships Australia for a couple of reasons. Because we were secular, or we are secular, we're all about respectful relationships. And this included everyone, in particularly the elderly, the vulnerable and LGBTIQ+ communities, which was very important to him. So we've operated as a backbone organisation for the campaign since 2014, and there are 3 elements. It's a stakeholder management framework, tools and materials that support events and neighbourly actions, and an online mainstream communications campaign. You might wonder what it looked like back in the day. Well, Neighbour Day prior to our stewardship was fairly bare bones. It was a very simple website with a poster, a little bit of an explanation and some events listed with a few phone numbers. We wanted to establish up front that Relationships Australia was serious about this new to us social connection campaign. So we did a few things straight up that helped us get some traction. We refreshed the branding to sort of the house-shaped N you might recognise. We updated the website, provided a swag of tips, ideas, free resources, incentives, competitions, all to just make getting involved as easy as possible. We found some great and very generous Neighbour Day ambassadors, Costa Georgiadis, Natalie Armat, Julie Goodwin and Hugh McKay. And since then, we've had a number more join us, and they're equally as amazing. We've also connected and partnered with some very terrific, and I know there's lots of superlatives, but they're amazing, very neighbourly organisations. For those of you who don't know what that is, they're organisations that uphold and promote the principles of Neighbour Day. These important organisations are able and committed to helping respectful relationships, helping increase respectful relationships across Australia, one social connection at a time. Many of them are helping out now in the floods up north. We acknowledged our first 15 VNOs in 2015, and Are You OK was the very first. The first councils were Lane Cove Council in the east and City of Albany in the west. Since then, we've acknowledged more than 50 national, state, territory, local and regional organisations from all sectors. And if you want to know what Neighbourly looks like, visit our website, because they're all there and they're doing it every day of the year. Numerous local champions have emerged, which has been exciting, and they have led social connection in their communities in every state and territory. Belinda, her real name, was working with the council at the time. She was doing a regional leadership course in the Sunbury region, and she catalysed more than 80 events with more than 400 participants. So that was exciting. When Neighbour Day campaign found a home at Relationships Australia, we recognised the need to begin formally evaluating the impact of this campaign and what it was doing with and for communities. Our program purpose, logic and outcomes, and the language we use has become clearer and more focused over the years. We wanted to establish that Neighbour Day aims to increase positive and sustainable social connections between people and communities throughout Australia. In doing so, Relationships Australia, as the home of Neighbour Day, aims to support respectful relationships and assist in tackling the loneliness epidemic in this nation. We did our own evaluations in 2016, 17 and 18, and many surveys. The campaign engagement was growing each year and the anecdotal feedback was fantastic. Our research told us that people found Neighbour Day a great tool, a reason, an excuse, a gentle and nationally recognised welcoming way to reach out and connect. We did a bit more research of our own monthly online surveys looking at loneliness, neighbourhood identification, community participation and relationships with neighbours. Then in 2018, we took on a larger project looking at findings from 16 waves of HILDA data, so that's Household Income and Labour Dynamics of Australia data, that identified which Australians are most likely to feel lonely and socially isolated and when. This is called Is Australia Experiencing an Epidemic of Loneliness? And I commend it to you. But we needed some external help to help us capture what was really happening with Neighbour Day and the social impacts. Relationships Australia was one of the founding members of the Australian Coalition to End Loneliness, now known as Ending Loneliness Together. And through that group, we met the wonderful Dr. Michelle Lim, a senior lecturer in clinical psychology, and she leads the Social Health and Wellbeing Laboratory at Swinburne. We commissioned Swinburne to supplement our existing internal evaluation with a qualitative account of the lived experience of hosting Neighbour Day events. We're especially interested in understanding how, why and when hosts got involved, what actually happened at an event, and the ongoing effect that that campaign was having on those people and their communities. We found that Neighbour Day was supporting people to create, renew and deepen relationships with their neighbours. We also found that many had been running Neighbour Day events for some time. As these gained traction, neighbours began to organise and take ownership over the day. However, it was difficult to assess the exact changes brought on by Neighbour Day, as hosts were already highly involved in their communities. In order to assess the changes to social capital, social inclusion and wellbeing, we felt it necessary to connect with all involved in celebrating Neighbour Day, including the attendees. So this initial test, this nested study of external research, motivated us to learn, and we partnered with the ANU to undertake the Neighbour Day campaign research and evaluation for the past 3 years. But before I hand over, I'd just like to read you something I wrote for the most recent Veranda e-News to plant a seed. We live in a complex world, and during challenging times, we all do our best to manage our busy lives and our relationships with family, friends, and others around us. Possibly one of the biggest and most positive shifts we have observed has been during the pandemic. So many people, and not just the usual people, have been stepping up, reaching out and helping others in both small and big ways. Checking in on a neighbour in person, a phone call or online, helping with shopping, dropping off a meal, volunteering unofficially or for some who can officially, has become the norm for many. Despite busy lives, many have moved from me to we, and they feel better for it. Some of us are living in an extended supportive community where reaching out to others has become part of our daily lives. However, this is not everyone's experience. There are just under 4 weeks before we celebrate Neighbour Day on Sunday, 27 March, and now is the perfect time to think about what you might do to mark our 20th anniversary of connecting communities. So that's it from me, and now to Tegan and Claire will share what we've learned and make a case for getting involved in Neighbour Day 2022 and every day. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam. That's fantastic. And just before I introduce Tegan, can I just remind everyone that we are very happy to take any questions that you have today of any of our presenters, Sam, Tegan and Claire. Please go ahead and pop them in the chat box, and we will hopefully have time to get to as many of them as possible after the presentations. All right, I'm pleased now to introduce Associate Professor Tegan Cruwys of the Research School of Psychology at the Australian National University. Tegan is a NHMRC Emerging Leadership Fellow, and the research that Tegan and her team have conducted for Neighbour Day over the years has helped us to understand not only the effectiveness of the campaign, but also its value as a social connection campaign. So to tell us more about that, over to you, Tegan. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. And thanks very much for this opportunity. I think that working with Relationships Australia is, in my mind, one of the best collaborations that can happen between university and industry, is really us running in the same direction with the kind of shared vision of what we're trying to achieve. And I'm coming to you today from Ngunnawal country in Canberra. So I'm going to take about 25 minutes today to talk through the findings, the key findings of the research from the last 3 years. But I just wanted to start my presentation by taking a bit of a step back and talking about the state of the literature more broadly when it comes to the link between social connection and health. Because in fact, this is a relationship that we've known for many decades now to be extremely strong and robust. So indeed, this is the key findings from a meta-analysis that was published in 2010, so 12 years ago now, that summarised the findings of almost 150 studies, over 300,000 participants, and looked at some of the predictors of early mortality and compared the usual suspects to social connection. And you can see here that when we look at the size of these odds ratios, social connection actually had stronger relationships with the risk of premature death than smoking, than alcohol, than physical activity, all of these things that we know are crucial for our health. And in fact, we talk about an enormous amount as a society as issues that we need to address if we want to optimize our health. Indeed, the relationship between social connection and mental health is even stronger than that of physical health. But although these effects are very strong, I would say that the science has been much better at establishing this relationship than it has been in working out what we should do about it. So when it comes to what we should do to promote social connection, actually the initial findings have been pretty disappointing. So some researchers have tried trying to teach people social skills. They've tried befriending interventions, which are interventions where usually a young person goes into an older person's residence and befriends an individual and visits them regularly. And those early interventions actually didn't seem to be very effective at reducing loneliness and bolstering social connection. So a meta-analysis that was published in 2011 summarised the literature to date as the most we can say is that these interventions achieve, at best, only modest improvement, but not recovery. So I would say our first efforts scientifically to do something about social connection weren't profoundly effective. And that stands in stark contrast to many other areas where we have tried psychological interventions to bolster health. And in my view, one of the reasons why these early interventions weren't particularly effective is because they lacked a focus on building social group connection. So we believe that one of the main reasons why social connection is so powerful and protective for our health is not just because it's pleasant to have friendships or that it's a nice way to spend your time, but that the groups that we're part of actually give rise to our sense of identity, our sense of who we are, our self-definition, and from that flows purpose, meaning, and reasons for living. So it's not just about having nice friendships, it's about being a nurse, being a Canberran, being an Australian. And so it is those interventions that do this that are likely to be the most effective, we think. So myself and my colleagues have really been trying to explore this over the last decade. And I would say that as we have moved from looking at those traditional befriending or social skills interventions and into more of these social identity interventions, we have seen much better efficacy when it comes to boosting social connection and benefiting well-being. So these, the Steffens et al. Reference there is a meta-analysis which found growing evidence for efficacy of these social identity-based interventions in a whole range of diverse contexts. So it includes things like small group psychotherapeutic interventions, like a sort of group therapy context, as well as things like an Endeavour boat journey for disadvantaged teens that happens in New Zealand. So really diverse situations there that seem to be having some benefit. However, I think there's a big drawback of these existing interventions, and that is that they tend to be small group and highly resource intensive. So those group psychotherapy interventions, for instance, require 2 health professionals to facilitate a group of 5 to 8 individuals who might benefit. And the problem with an intervention that looks like that is it's never really going to be scalable in order to benefit whole communities, in order to do something about the burden of mental health issues that we're seeing in our whole community at the moment. And we know we have major shortages when it comes to mental health professionals. So we need solutions that don't require that level of investment, even though it'd be nice if we're also investing in that way as well. So my view is that there's a real need for scalable interventions that have greater reach, that are able to achieve these kind of benefits. And so that's where Neighbour Day comes in from a scientific perspective, because I think it has 3 strengths that really make it very promising in terms of filling that gap in the literature. The first one is that it really is the definition of scalable. So unlike those smaller scale interventions, you know, it really is already embedded in hundreds and hundreds of suburbs right around the nation. Relationships Australia estimates that Neighbour Day is reaching about 300,000 people per year already. So even if it was having only very small benefits for each individual, that would add up to a very significant public health benefit. And so it is already at scale if it is having those benefits. And I think that that's a really exciting prospect. The second reason I think Neighbour Day is promising is that it focuses on groups and not on individuals. So it's already oriented towards those kind of activities that might be effective in building that social identification with one's local neighbourhood and community, which the theoretical work suggests are those interventions that are likely to be the most effective. And finally, something that I think is a real strength of the Neighbour Day approach is that it is grassroots. This is not about people who think they know best telling individuals what they ought to be doing for their social connection or their well-being. It's really about facilitating communities to support one another and to decide what they need. Neighbour Day doesn't need to look the same in each neighbourhood or in each community. And I think that that is a strength of this approach, is that it really does enable people to use their creative juices to actually facilitate what is most likely to have benefit in their community from people who know best. So with that as a background for why we think Neighbour Day is likely to have these kind of benefits, the 2019 evaluation sought to answer that question of, does Neighbour Day boost neighbourhood identification, that social identification with one's local community? And if it does that have any flow-on benefits that we might expect? As you can see from the picture, the first evaluation that I worked with Relationships Australia on in 2019, we surveyed 437 hosts of Neighbour Day events, and they were based in 344 suburbs around Australia. So we were able to access, as you can tell from the diagram, people who are living in quite diverse communities around Australia. These are not just your traditional suburban, metro suburbs. These are people in communities that are both advantaged and disadvantaged, that are both urban as well as quite rural and regional. And so we asked them about their social connection, their Neighbour Day events, as well as their well-being. We surveyed them at 3 time points. About 1 month before Neighbour Day, about 1 month after Neighbour Day, and then a 6-month follow-up in October. So the first primary finding of the 2019 evaluation was that hosts did experience a sustained increase in their identification with their neighbourhood. So you can see in this diagram here that this is a 7-point scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. We see on average an increase from baseline to post Neighbour Day. and that those 3 asterisks there mean that it's a p equals less than 0.001. I'm going to try not to get too much into the statistical weeds today, but happy to answer any questions people have about where these numbers are coming from if you do want more detail. Whereas the 1 asterisk just means p is less than 0.05, so still a statistically significant result, but one that we're not quite as confident about. So what you can see here is that neighbourhood identification is increasing significantly after Neighbour Day, and that it's not decreasing again 6 months later. So having been involved in hosting some kind of event does seem to have a prolonged benefit for people in terms of that identification on average. What sort of flow-on effects does that have then in terms of the rest of people's lives? Well, what we're seeing is that that increase in neighbourhood identification is associated with an increased perception first of social cohesion, so that is general trust and connectedness within the community, as well as reduced personal loneliness for those hosts. So both of those things are changing over that same time period from time 1 to time 2. And then in turn, each of those is predicting better well-being for our hosts up to 6 months later. So it does seem to be the case that Neighbour Day is benefiting people's social connection, that it's having benefits for well-being, and both of those things are not short-lived. They are being sustained up to 6 months later. And those results, if you're keen on finding out more, were published late last year in Social Science and Medicine, and I'd be happy to provide a copy of the paper if anyone wants to reach out after today as well. So in 2020, our primary goal was really to replicate and extend these findings, but the COVID context did sort of come along and put something of a spanner in our works. We surveyed 235 respondents in March, and if you can cast your mind back to March 2020, COVID was really a thing that was happening overseas for most of us during March of 2020. It hadn't really taken much effect on our shores, but by the time that Neighbour Day rolled around at the end of March, we were in fact under one of our strictest lockdown restrictions, and so Neighbour Day had to quickly be pivoted for hosts into some kind of online or remote forum, such that people were able to carry it out within the guidelines and the restrictions that were in place at the time. So we asked people then at time 2, we added questions about what people had been able to do, if anything. And for many people, they had been able to organise some kind of online activity or checking in on elderly neighbours if they needed groceries help or anything of that nature. And then at time 3, we did follow up again in October and November, and we were able to recruit about 150 of our hosts at that point as well. So despite the complexities of doing research in the times that we live in, we were nevertheless able to, in our 2020 evaluation, replicate some of those key findings. So we're seeing here in the top left that neighbourhood identification did increase significantly in 2020 for our hosts, and that was sustained at time 3. We see similar changes in sense of belonging and in neighbourhood satisfaction. And these are all standardised measures that are widely used in the literature. We see something slightly different for loneliness, which is in the bottom right here. Loneliness, we saw a significant increase from time 1 to time 2 that then had decreased to below time 1 by follow-up point. And I think that it's important to interpret that effect in light of the situation in which our hosts were completing that time 2 survey, which after all was under pretty strict lockdown restrictions, as well as an enormous amount of anxiety, I think, because it was very early in the pandemic at that point. It did seem to be that people were coming right back down by time 3, though, in terms of their loneliness. We also asked people, as I mentioned, about what kinds of events they had been able to organise, and we categorised people in the 2020 data set into those who were able to do something for Neighbour Day versus those who had to cancel their plans because of the restrictions. And what we found is that those people who were able to do any kind of activity did actually report a greater confidence that if they needed support from their neighbourhood, for instance, because they had to self-isolate, that they felt more confident that that support would be forthcoming. So it did seem like there were some benefits that were specific to those hosts who had been able to organise some kind of activity. In the 2020 dataset, we also elicited some qualitative, some open-ended responses from our hosts, and we had some really wonderful feedback. I'll just highlight some of these key ones here. One respondent says, however wide my contacts are, it's my neighbours who are my immediate source of friendship and support. In a year when wider interactions have been restricted, my close neighbours have become closer. It's made connection all the more important. Another respondent says, Neighbour Day is always very important for the street and other locals. Just keep doing what you're doing now. Another has some good advice. I feel a little bit like people in my neighbourhood don't know what it is. I think it should try to become more of a thing that people know about, like Clean Up Australia Day. Maybe if you have the money, you could spend it on a TV advertising campaign. I feel like your target market does and would respond positively to an ad about Neighbour Day and would want to be involved if they knew what it was. And I think there is that growing sense, I think, from hosts that this could be even bigger than it already is, that there is a real appetite and market for Neighbour Day out there in the community. So moving finally to the 2021 evaluation of Neighbour Day, and I believe Relationships Australia is releasing the report on this analysis today. So we will hear that confirmed from Claire after I speak, but you should be able to get your hands on this report from now if that is the case, or very shortly. So in 2021, we wanted to expand on the evaluation in several ways. Firstly, we wanted to recruit a comparison group, so people who weren't involved in Neighbour Day and hadn't even heard of Neighbour Day, so that we could be confident that these positive changes we're seeing are definitely specific to that group. We also wanted to explore other types of social connection. So not just connection to neighbours, but what other kinds of benefits might Neighbour Day be having for people's connection with community. So 2021 did not prove to be a simple year in terms of COVID either. So this is a bit of a diagram about how our data collection worked. We were pretty ambitious with our sample, and we were able to recruit over 800 people at baseline using a variety of methods, both what we'd used in the past around mailing lists and Relationships Australia's contacts and websites through people involved in Neighbour Day, but also Facebook advertising to the broader community. And we recruited people initially in June, and then we actually ended up delaying our time by quite a bit because we didn't want to survey people while they were in extended lockdown, especially since in 2020 we saw some negative effects of that lockdown on social connection measures. So we held off, and as you can see, most of the country experienced some kind of lockdown during that period, second half of 2021. And then we managed to recruit our follow-up, which was of almost 500 people through November and early December. So that was when Australia had largely come out of 2021 lockdowns, but Omicron hadn't yet disrupted our summer plans. So 2021, then we had a sample of people who had, we asked people if they'd heard of Neighbour Day before, and a bit over a third of people had. And about 15% had participated in any events or activities related to Neighbour Day in 2021 specifically. Now, 15% might sound like a small percentage, but because we had recruited a much larger sample in 2021, that still was 125 people. So it gave us enough statistical power to be able to make those comparisons that we were hoping to make. So firstly, we were interested in whether those effects we saw in Neighbour Day, the benefits of Neighbour Day for neighbourhood identification, were generalisable, were distinct from our non-participants. So is it the case that our non-Neighbour Day participants are not seeing those kind of benefits? And indeed, that's what we see here. So in summary, at both time 1 and time 2, both of which were after Neighbour Day, we see that our participants reported greater identification with their neighbourhood, and indeed greater identification with multiple social groups. So they had more meaningful social groups in general. And we wanted to drill down too, for the first time, to see whether that was specific to our hosts or whether it was generalizable to attendees, people who were just coming along to events. Because I think there's been a bit of a fear that Neighbour Day might be doing more for the people who are kind of putting in the effort and organising these events than for people who are just coming along. But in fact, that's not what we found. So there was actually no statistical differences between our attendees and our hosts or organisers of Neighbour Day events on any of these indicators. So that, I think, is reassuring that it is seeming to have these benefits both for attendees and hosts, and therefore reaching a great number of people. We then went on to investigate whether there were, in fact, any moderators of who benefits from Neighbour Day. So is it the case that people are more likely to benefit if they are, of a particular age, if they're living in a particular type of community or neighbourhood? We looked at age, we looked at gender, education, relationship status, employment status, neighbourhood, socioeconomic status, and none of these factors moderated the benefits that people were receiving from Neighbour Day. So the key takeaway from that really is that it doesn't seem to be the case that the benefits of Neighbour Day are only being felt by a small segment of society. It seems like if people get involved in Neighbour Day, they are getting those benefits regardless of who they are, at least on the basis of the data we have so far, which I think is a pretty exciting message. So moving along then to other kinds of social connection, which, as I mentioned, we were interested in this study, we actually found it's a much bigger effects than we were expecting in many ways. It seems like Neighbour Day participants connected more often and with more people in general. So they had more diversity in their social networks, they had greater networks in terms of the size, they had more frequent contact, and they spent more time on each occasion with those social networks. In terms of how they were connecting with their networks, Neighbour Day participants connected more via every medium, in fact, face-to-face, email, phone, text message, letters. The only kind we saw no significant differences between Neighbour Day participants and our non-participants was in social media use. So that's where we weren't seeing any differences, and I'm sure you all have some theories about why that might be. And then, sorry, this is the busiest slide I'm going to show you today, but what this analysis is testing is whether Neighbour Day participation actually supported positive changes in people's relationships with other kinds of networks in their lives. So not just neighbours, but other kinds of networks. So controlling for how satisfied they were with different kinds of social relationships at time 1, can we predict how satisfied they are at time 2? And the answer is yes. So Neighbour Day participation predicted greater identification with their neighbourhood, as we've talked about before. And that variable in turn was associated with more positive relationships with all different kinds of networks. So colleagues, ex-colleagues, neighbours, friends, family, extended family. The only type of relationship that wasn't significantly bolstered by neighbourhood identification was actually relationship with one's partner. So I think that again, that's a stronger effect than we were expecting to see. There does seem to be this sort of flow-on effect from one's neighbourhood connections through to other kinds of social relationships in one's life. And the final set of findings I want to talk you through now relates to wellbeing and psychological distress in our 2021 sample. So as you saw from the timeline I showed you before, this was a bit of a difficult time for our sample as a whole. I'd say for Australia as a whole. The second half of 2021 had an awful lot of setbacks for many people. And so perhaps it's not surprising that we saw overall a significant decrease in wellbeing in the sample and a significant increase in psychological distress. So it does seem like people were feeling the effects of those extended lockdowns on the sample overall. But the advantage, I suppose, of a sample that is struggling is it enables us to test whether that Neighbour Day participation acted as protective in any way. And that is indeed what we found. So Neighbour Day participants had greater wellbeing at follow-up, and this occurred indirectly, and it occurred via their improved neighbourly connections. So because of their greater number of close neighbours and greater identification with their neighbourhood, Neighbour Day participants tended to have better wellbeing. And we see the same effects for psychological distress. In this case, they had less psychological distress at follow-up because of their improved neighbourly connections. And these analyses, again, I don't want to get it too far into the weeds, but they do statistically control for some potential confounding variables. So things like age, gender, education, neighbourhood, socioeconomic status, whether or not people experienced a long lockdown, and relationship status. So we can be relatively confident that the relationship is being driven by these variables rather than those other things. So that's all the data I wanted to go through today with you, but I just to give you a bit of a summary of the kind of key findings, I guess, that I take away from the analyses we've done to date. The first one is that I am increasingly convinced, because of the robustness of the evidence that we are receiving for the benefits of Neighbour Day. I think Neighbour Day should be seen as a community-led approach to supporting public mental health, because that's what the data are telling us in this regard. The way Neighbour Day achieves this is primarily because it provides a sustained boost to the meaningful connections that people have with their neighbours. Not just with individuals in their neighbourhood, but with that subjective sense of belonging to something greater, that sense of community that comes with being embedded in that network. And the benefits of Neighbour Day don't seem to be limited to particularly advantaged members of the community either, or those in traditional suburban neighbourhoods. So I think there was a fear early on that Neighbour Day might be doing the most work for sort of middle-aged white women who are relatively middle class, who are working hard to organise these events. And while those people are benefiting from Neighbour Day, we haven't got any evidence so far that they're the only ones who are benefiting. In fact, it seems to be relatively non-discriminatory when it comes to who is getting those benefits. And I think that's exciting. So what's next then? What do we need in terms of further evidence to kind of progress Neighbour Day? There are a few suggestions I have in terms of things that we could be doing next and bolstering this evidence-based. I think the more we can focus on particularly marginalised or at-risk communities, the better, both because I think that's where who will benefit the most from these interventions. They're the ones that are in greatest need, but also because we might see that relatively light touch interventions can do their best work in those communities as well. Secondly, I think that there is a need for economic evaluation for Neighbour Day. I think my inclination is to predict that there would be a really strong cost effectiveness argument to be made for Neighbour Day, because if it is having these really widespread community mental health benefits, it's also likely to be much more cost effective than many of the other approaches to managing mental health that we have in our community. So I'd like to see someone do the numbers on that, and I think that would be really compelling. And finally, I think the strongest evidence we could really have for Neighbour Day is if we were able to conduct a controlled experimental study. So that would be where we randomly assign neighbourhoods to either have a Neighbour Day type intervention versus not. And I think a study like that would be really when we'd be in the strongest possible position to make causal claims that it is Neighbour Day causing these benefits, which at the moment we have to be somewhat tentative about concluding that. But I think as more and more evidence comes in, that is definitely the direction that it's pointing us in. So I just wanted to leave you today with, I guess, a broader observation of where I see this all fitting in. And that is that, you know, as I started today's presentation, social connectedness is one of the strongest predictors of good health that is known to science. But I think sometimes we can hear that and get off on the wrong foot and think that it's as simple as telling people to just go out there and make friends, which it is not. Social connection doesn't develop in a vacuum. It's not something that people can do on their own. By definition, it is something that must be fostered in community and groups. In fact, loneliness is often a symptom of having been excluded by others, you know, being ostracized or discriminated against. And so to me, what these findings are really telling us is that it is our collective responsibility to create inclusive communities. And if we do that, that brings the benefits to everybody. It gives everyone the opportunity to derive the benefits, both social and in terms of health, that such communities have to offer. So I'm going to leave it there today and pass back over to Claire. I just wanted to finish by acknowledging the other people who've been involved in this evaluation. So they're in the bottom right-hand corner there. And in particular, Dr. Polly Fong, who has helped me and worked with me really closely all along the way as we've been doing this evaluation. So back to you, Claire, and thanks very much.
Thanks, Tegan. I'm just going to get back to sharing my screen. There we go. So my name's Claire. I'm the Senior Research and Project Officer at Relationships Australia National. And part of my role there is to essentially translate the knowledge that we learn through all of our research projects and help people understand what that means for relationships. So that's what I'm going to try and do for you all today. So what does everything that Tegan has just so beautifully summarised mean for us at Relationships Australia? So as we all know, relationships have been challenged in the last few years. There's flooding, fires, pandemics, wars, it's all happening. So I guess Neighbour Day seeks to address these issues, and we're using preventative measures to do so. And these increases in loneliness and isolation shows a huge need for support in the community. So as Tegan said, Neighbour Day improves neighbourhood satisfaction and neighbourhood identification. But what does this mean for relationships themselves? So neighbourhood identification is a person's sense of identity with their neighbourhood. This seems a little bit silly to define something using the words in the word, but essentially our sense of identity is usually quite an individual concept. So your identity comes from your beliefs and values and things like that. And when you create a shared identity, this is the way that we access social support. So essentially Neighbour Day is trying to improve people's shared identity with those around them. So the role of neighbourhood identification is essentially it plays a key part in achieving respectful relationships across the lifespan. And much of our research across the last 4 years has hinged upon this concept of neighbourhood identification. So what I thought I'd do for you today is explain how neighbourhood identification is affecting our work at Relationships Australia. So the first thing I'm going to cover is resilience during the pandemic. So there's no doubt that the pandemic and the other ongoing crises that are occurring right now are having a huge effect on Australians. As Tegan covered, there's psychological distress and wellbeing continue to be affected, and we don't claim that Neighbour Day will completely negate these effects. However, across our years of evaluation, we have noticed that there is improved wellbeing during lockdown in the participants of Neighbour Day, sustained reductions in loneliness, which extend up to 6 months after Neighbour Day, improvements in their mental health, and also some reductions in psychological distress. So these factors are being influenced by a person's perception of their access to the support around them. So essentially what is happening is that when people feel that they know their neighbours, so through Neighbour Day, they've said hello to their neighbour, they've learnt their name, then when it comes to a pandemic and they're forced to stay inside their home, they feel more able to ask their neighbour to go collect some groceries for them while they're isolating. So Neighbour Day is increasing neighbourhood identification and therefore increasing people's ability to ask others for support. And what happens when people feel that support from one part of their life is that it extends to others. So this is especially true for people who identify with lots of different groups. So as Tegan pointed out, we found this in our 2020 study, that people who are involved in lots of different sporting teams or church groups, gardening groups, men's sheds, whatever group it is, if they're diversifying their community in that way, they feel that they can ask people like their friends and family for support as well. And this includes getting to know your neighbourly group. So connecting with your neighbours or any group around you in the community is the key to accessing support. And the support isn't just coming from neighbours, but from everyone. So the next section is wider, larger social networks. So Tegan already looked at this a little bit, but I'll cover it again. So we found that people who get involved in Neighbour Day have wider, larger social networks. And this graph shows that across the board, there was increasing time and occasions spent socialising across Neighbour Day participants compared to non-participants. And Tegan did mention that the social media was the only non-significant finding. And I thought it was quite interesting that Relationships Australia actually released a report in 2011 showing that people who frequently felt lonely were more likely to use Facebook to communicate with their friends, family, and potential partners. Obviously, that's quite an old study, and Facebook in 2011 is quite different to now, but it is interesting to consider that in the findings. So despite this, Neighbour Day participation supports connection across all kinds of relationships and modalities, and it's not just neighbours. The last thing I wanted to look at was relationship satisfaction. So I think this is one of the most important findings for those who work at Relationships Australia, which I can see there's quite a few of you on the webinar today. And during the study, we asked respondents to rate their relationship satisfaction across time with all of these different groups. And Neighbour Day participants had improved satisfaction with all relationship types and improved mental health and wellbeing over time as a result of this satisfaction. So at Relationships Australia, we already know that relational satisfaction is a really important part of wellbeing. And so essentially what we're showing is that Neighbour Day is predicting improvements in all relationships and not just neighbourly relationships. So that means that improving our neighbourly relationships helps us in our other work, especially with family, friends, colleagues. So Neighbour Day is having an effect not only on our neighbourly relationships, but across the across the relational spectrum. So in summary, neighbourhood identification is key to good mental health, social connection, well-being, resilience in challenging times, wider, larger social networks, and relationship satisfaction. So knowing your neighbours is more than just the kind thing to do. It can have huge impacts across the lifespan for individuals and communities. So what next? This brings the end to our work with ANU for now. We would love to keep working with them, especially on some of the projects that Tegan has mentioned today. But what next for the Neighbour Day campaign? We're now looking into council implementation studies. So we believe that local governments are one of the frontline groups involved in community development. And we also at Neighbour Day provide resources and support for councils to increase the social connection in their LGA. Our project will be measuring the community capacity in specific LGAs, identifying key areas for improvement, and producing solution-focused materials to address these ongoing challenges. We'll be starting in Moreland City Council, which is in Melbourne, and then we'll be moving to other councils for those interested. So if you'd like to get your council involved, please contact me, and that's my email address there. And thank you. I think we're on to the questions now.
Wonderful. Thanks, Claire, and thanks, Tegan. And yes, now very happy to take any questions through the chat box, as we mentioned earlier. I'll pick up on something you were saying, Claire, which I think also Tegan touched on, just in terms of the first question that we have here, and that is the effect of Neighbour Day as a protective factor in areas where there are disasters, such as what we're seeing right now with Queensland and New South Wales. And I think, Claire, as you mentioned, the resilience is an important outcome of neighbourhood connection and neighbourhood identification and mutual support. Is there anything else you want to say to that point specifically? I know our research hasn't specifically looked at natural disasters, but
yeah, sure. So there is quite significant research done from the bushfires in Victoria in 2009, I believe, that has shown essentially quite similar results to what we have. So it's this multi-group identification and neighbourly identification that is helping people stay protected from the ongoing effects of the bushfire. So that was a 10-year study that was really expansive, and it found really similar findings. So we can be pretty confident that while our research last year only covered the pandemic and it didn't cover everything else that we're going through as a nation, the findings stand true across different types of natural disasters.
Excellent. Thanks, Claire. Questions, obviously, also for Sam and Tegan, for those who are interested in finding out more about anything we've covered today. Please feel free. Maybe while we wait, Sam, if I can throw a question to you. What has been the best part for you in working on the Neighbour Day campaign and watching it grow over the years?
Am I off mute?
Yes.
Okay. Look, I'd like to say it's great people and fabulous ambassadors and organisations and councils and local champions, and it's kind and it's positive and it restores my faith in humanity. You know, it's probably the best job I've ever had. But probably what I would say is over the years, it's become woven into the fabric of Relationships Australia as an organisation as to who we are and what we do. It is our social connection campaign. And probably the best thing, if I could choose only one out of all the amazing things that have happened, is the research tells us it's working. It's more than just great stories. It's needed, it's real, and it's making a positive difference. So for all those years we thought it was doing something, I'm just so delighted that it's making a positive impact.
Thanks, Sam. That's excellent, and I agree wholeheartedly. I think on behalf of Relationships Australia, really delighted to see the growth and to be part of this really important campaign. Another question here, I think aimed at you, Tegan, in relation to demographic data. Can you please remind us if there was any differential between regional and metro locations, or if this will occur in the future?
Yeah, good question. We have looked at that, and we've used the ABS coding for, I guess, regionality. So that's a 5-point scale ranging from sort of inner metro through to very remote, and we haven't found any effects on that at all. I would say that we have much lower representation of people in those particularly remote communities. So if we want to be really confident that it's working in those communities, we need to sample a greater number of people from them. But at least today, we don't have any evidence that it's not working for people in regional areas, which is great to know.
Excellent, thanks, Tegan. And while you're off mute, another question has come in for you. What makes Neighbour Day different to some of the other social connection campaigns or tools that you have evaluated? Yeah,
that's a lovely question. And so this is you know, broadly, I do a lot of evaluations of this kind of thing, I suppose, you know, 12 or maybe 20 different things, but they generally seem to be so much smaller in scale. And I think that's where I'm excited about Neighbour Day, is because there are some really wonderful interventions out there and some things that people are doing to connect communities that are really powerful and effective, but they're reaching such small numbers by comparison. And I think that, especially when I see, you know, over the last 2 years, the wait time to see a psychologist in this country has increased to the point where many psychologists have their books closed entirely. Those that have a waiting list are looking at 6 to 12 months of waiting period. We really need a better way of keeping people well and getting them well. And so I think we need solutions like Neighbour Day that have the potential to reach many, many, many people in our communities, not just small groups facilitated by highly qualified health professionals. So I'd say that's really the thing that sets Neighbour Day apart from my perspective.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tegan. Claire, a question for you. What can practitioners in RA and other support services take away from these evaluations?
I think probably just the importance of neighbours. I think as a general concept, we understand that community is important, but to see the real impacts that it has on all our other relationships with our family and friends and colleagues, I think that's something to consider across everything that we do.
Absolutely. Thanks, Claire. A couple of the other points that have been raised in the chat box, there will be a recording made available. So anyone who is registered for today's webinar will receive the recording. And I think we should be able to make the slides available as well as part of that. But we'll just check, Tegan, that that's okay with you. Good, the thumbs up, thank you. And in relation to the research, the link has gone up in the chat box, but we're really very pleased today to be able to launch our 2021 evaluation study. Tegan mentioned the amazing team at ANU who've been involved in conducting this research for us or with us. Tegan, Polly, and the whole team there, and we've been so grateful to have such an I think invested and passionate group to work with, and I think that, you know, the results show just how important Neighbour Day is, but also I think it's been a really enjoyable project to work with you on. So thanks to Tegan, and thank you for giving your time today to share these findings. They're now available on the Neighbour Day website. Really can't stress enough how grateful we are to everyone who's joined us today to take part in the webinar and to discuss these findings. We hope that this is just the beginning of an ongoing conversation in relation to what we can all be doing. As Tegan said, I think there's a call there to continue looking at how we can scale up Neighbour Day and reach even more Australians, particularly those in vulnerable communities. When we look at what's happening up and down the eastern coast at the moment, I think there are opportunities for communities to rally together, and as they are doing, and anything we can do to support that and to support resilience in communities across the country is vital. So thank you all. As I said, the recording will be made available, and we wish you all a very happy rest of your week and look forward to seeing you on Neighbour Day, which is the 27th of March, the last Sunday in March. And if you haven't yet, jump onto the website and download some of the Neighbour Day resources. And if you're planning an event, make sure you register it on the website and share with us what you're doing. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.